Okay. We will start the shir. As you said, we'll first start with a vert on the parsha. Then we'll go on to a bite-sized concept in Chassidus, and then we'll move on to an interesting halacha. This week's parsha is Parshas Boy, which starts off that Hashem tells Moshe, Boy el Pari, come to Pari. And it goes on, it says, because I've hardened, I hardened Pari's heart, and in order to show my miracles and so on. And Rashi says, Boy el Pari, come to Pari to warn him. In other words, to give him a warning that if he doesn't let the Jews out, he will get these plagues upon him. Now, there's the obvious question that many ask, if God hardened his heart, why would he be punished? In other words, free will was taken away from him. But without getting into the whole question of free will, this also is an illustration of what the Alter Rebbe writes in Tanya, that if somebody, it says about various sins, it says that they're not going to, they don't let him do tshuva. They don't grant him the opportunity to do tshuva. And the Alter Rebbe remarks about this, that it says, they don't grant him the opportunity to do tshuva. But that does mean that if the person pushes himself, so to speak, he pushes his foot, he puts his foot in the door and he pushes, he is able to do tshuva. And that's in fact what happened with Pari. And that's why Rashi says, Boy el Pari, to warn him. If Pari has no choice, what's the point in warning him? He has no choice anyways. But it wasn't just a show. It was illustrating a point that even somebody like Pari, even though it says that Hashem hardens your heart, nevertheless, if someone really, really pushes himself and really, really wants to do tshuva, even somebody like Pari could do tshuva. And that is the lesson to us, that no matter where we are, even if we're on such a level that it says from heaven they don't want to let the person do tshuva, nevertheless, if he pushes himself, he's able to do tshuva. And the reason for that is, especially in a Jew, has to do with the person's soul, with the neshama, which that brings us to our bite-sized concept in Chassidus. So last week we finished off, we spoke about a little bit about the animal soul, because we said in order to understand what a beimnini is, to understand the struggle of a person, we have to know what's the makeup of a person. So we explained what an animal soul is. But this week we're going to talk about the godly soul. And it's because of this godly soul that we just mentioned that the person has the opportunity to do tshuva. And as we'll explain, when it comes to the godly soul, so the Alter Rebbe brings 3 descriptions to explain how the godly soul is different and how it's really close to God. First of all, the Alter Rebbe says, it brings from the pasuk, it says, "Vayipach ba'apav nishmas chaim," that God blew from the nostrils, he blew in a soul. So when somebody blows something, it's not like talking. It comes from the innards of the person. So it's he blows from inside. So the soul is really coming from, so to speak, the inner dimension of God. As the Alter Rebbe says, it's not just figuratively speaking chelik aleka, but it's literally, it's coming from God himself. So that's one description of how to explain and to describe the godly soul. Another description of how to describe the godly soul says Yisrael alu b'machshava, that Yisrael, the Jews, were alu b'machshava. They went up in God's machshava, in God's thought, meaning to say that the soul is different than other creations. We know, as explained elsewhere in Tanya and in Kabbalah, we see it really in Chumash itself, that creation was made with speech. Right? That God created the world with 10 utterances. But the soul is not made with an utterance. It's alu b'machshava. It's made with machshava, which machshava is higher than just speech. Speech, what is speech? Speech is something already an outer layer. You only need speech when there's something else. When you're dealing with another person, so you have to talk. If there's no other people, if you're for yourself, you don't have to talk. So speech is something already that has to do with the person himself, how it's going on. He's sitting alone. He's still thinking about whatever he's thinking about. So speech has to do with the person himself. So that's another way how we see that that the soul is connected to God himself, how he is for himself. And another example, the illustration really, that the Alter Rebbe gives, it says, Banim atem l'Hashem Elokeichem, that we are children of God. Just like a child, it says, so there's two partners of the child. There's the father and there's the mother. But before the mother comes and forms the child, right, it comes from the drop comes from the father. And as it explains, it comes from the Moach HaDe'av. It comes from the brain and the gland in the back, or however the Alter Rebbe explains it, but it comes from the father himself. Which that also is an illustration of how the soul is really connected to godliness. But the Alter Rebbe, if we notice, he brought three illustrations, and there's a reason for these three illustrations, and these three illustrations actually are going from lower to higher and deeper levels of how we are connected to God. The first one was about blowing, right? That God blew into the nostrils of Adam, he blew in his soul. So blowing is really a physical act. You blow, right? It's maybe not as physical as banging or walking, but it's still a physical act. So we're saying how physically we see how it's connected to God. But it's more of an outer blowing already has to do with someone else or some other object. Then we're saying another way of how the soul is connected to God is olav machshava, that it's connected to God. It came into God's thought. Thought is already something that has to do with the person himself. It's already more of a spiritual thing. It's not a physical thing. It's more spiritual in the sense that you can't really touch it. And then we have even deeper than that the creation, just like a father creates the child, the same thing, which comes from the father's essence in a way. So the same thing, when God is creating the soul, so to speak, it comes from the essence of God. And the truth is, there's really a difference, even though we're giving examples. The Alter Rebbe goes out of his way to stress that there's really a difference between these examples that we're giving them with God. Because by a person, when we're giving the example of machshava, that it comes from a person's from thought, or we're giving it that comes from the father, the drop comes from the father, which also has to do with the chachma of the father. By a person, they're really two different things. There's the machshava, his thought, and the person's essence. But with God, it's one and the same. That we can't separate God between God's thought and God's chachma, God's wisdom, and God himself. So the neshama is coming, so to speak, from God himself. And that's the greatness of the soul. Now, what is the purpose? Why do we have to know what the greatness of the soul is? This is all in preparation of what the point of the Tanya is, and as we're going to go on in further chapters to explain, we say the verse, that it's very close for a person, as we brought the example from Parai, but it's really talking about, that's even a non-Jew, but we're really talking about Jews. When we say that it's easy for the person to turn to God, or it's easy for a person to do a mitzvah, and he has an innate feeling of being close to God. Man, and especially, is the only creature that actually could have this feeling of feeling close to God, as opposed to other creations cannot. Other creations are made with speech. They can't have this feeling that they're constantly close to God, because speech, by definition, is something as a separate thing. Speech leaves the person and has to do with there being another entity, another creation. But man is made by thought. And therefore, man himself can have this feeling that he's constantly close to God, and he has the ability to do tshuva and become close to God and constantly strive to be closer to God. And that is the reason why the Alter Rebbe is starting to explain what the definition of a soul is. That is for our bite-size chassidus from Tanya today. Moving on into halacha, this was a discussion this past week in Shul, so we decided we'll talk about it. The question is, when you're at a kiddush and you have, right, so at a kiddush in Shul, you usually, most of the time, you're making, there's mezainis there. It's not hamaitzi. And there was a discussion whether do you have to cover the mezainis or not. Now, there's three reasons why you cover hamaitzi. Three general reasons. One of them is yakara the Shabbat. In other words, it's as if it used to be that they would bring the table with all the food right after Kiddush, to show that Kiddush, you made Kiddush, you sanctified Shabbos, and only now we're bringing, and in a respectful manner, it just gives it more of an honorary, respected way, the whole meal. So therefore, they would bring the food then, and now instead of that, we cover it. Then there's the other reason that it's brought because of like the man. The Lechem Mishnah represents the man, right? Because we got a double portion on Friday for Shabbos, so therefore we have two challahs. And just like the man, it says the man had a covering on the bottom. There was a bottom cover, then would come the man, and then there would be a layer on top. And to symbolize the man, we do the same thing with Lechem Mishnah. Then there's a third reason that we bring that's brought, that it has to do with not, so to speak, shaming the challah, because really mezainis should come first. When we're making in the order of brachas, hamaitzi comes first. I'll get to mezainis in a second. Hamaitzi comes first, but since the mitzvah is kiddush, so we're first making kiddush. In order not to embarrass, so to speak, the hamaitzi, we cover it. That's the three reasons why we cover the bread. And the question is whether those three reasons apply to mezainis or not. Now, two of the reasons seemingly do not apply. About bringing the whole meal now doesn't really apply to Shabbos day. Shabbos morning doesn't necessarily apply then, because Shabbos is not happening then. The concept of the man, the mezainis, isn't Lechem Mishnah. You're still going to have to make Lechem Mishnah. You didn't make Lechem Mishnah mezainis, right? So you're going to have to make Lechem Mishnah again. But this other concept of not shaming the mezainis, according to many, does apply to mezainis. And therefore, there are some who write, including the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch writes, that you really should cover the mezainis, at least the one who's making Kiddush, should cover the mezainis when they're making Kiddush at a Kiddush. Because mezainis also really, in theory, comes before Hagafen, and therefore you should cover it. Others, there's room for leniency. Others say that it's not necessary. The Eshel Avram says it's not necessary. And one of the reasons given for it not being necessary to cover it is that people aren't really, it's not really an ordinary thing that people want to be Yetze with the mezainis. They're not being Yetze. They're going to make a Yetze again later, and so on. And also it's a question of what's the main reason for covering it, and so on. And therefore there are others who say that it's not necessary to cover the it's not necessary to cover the mezainis when you make Kiddush. So to recap, we said the vart. Why we go to recap, going back to the beginning of the shir. We first said, why does it say poyo pari that Hashem Hashem hardened his heart? So without getting into the discussion too much into the paradox of free will, whether Pari had free will or not, according to Chassidus, it says, even when it says that that we don't give him the opportunity to do tshuva, nevertheless, if a person really pushes himself, he can do tshuva. Therefore, it says boy el pari, and Rashi says to warn him. Even though seemingly, what's Rashi coming to add? It says it's pretty clear in the pasuk, but Rashi is coming to add that don't think I'm just telling you to tell Pare that I'm going to bring Makos, but no, it says a warning. If Pare has no will, in other words, he has no will to say no, but I'm going to bring the Makos anyways, because he's not going to be able to let the Jews out. What's the point of a warning? Rather, the warning is because Pare does, if you really push, you always can do tshuva. And this has to do with the soul. And this brought us to the concept in Chassidus, what we said about the soul, that a person's soul has, it's like someone blows into something else. When you blow, it comes from the inside of the person. Two, it's alu machshava, it comes from the God's thought, which is even at a deeper level, it's more spiritual level, and even deeper than that, it's just like a child coming from the father. And since it comes from machshava, God's thought, therefore a thought is something that's constantly near, constantly close to the person who's thinking. And in this case, we're talking about God, whose thought and himself is one thing. We can't separate it, and therefore a person has the ability constantly to feel like he's close to God, as opposed to an animal that cannot have this ability because an animal is created through speech. Then we brought about mezainis, whether mezainis needs to be covered when you make kiddush at a kiddush. So we said it depends on what's the reason why you have to cover the mezainis. Some hold, like the Kiddush Shulchan Aruch holds, that you should cover it because of the reason of shaming the mezainis, because mezainis also in theory comes before hagafen, while others say since it's not really shaming the mezainis so much, because mezainis is really different than hamaitzi, in that hamaitzi in theory you can also make kiddush on it, but we don't. We're making it on wine, and therefore you're shaming the hamaitz, the challah. But the truth is, mezainis, you can't really make kiddush on the mezainis, and since you can't make kiddush on the mezainis, so you have to make really kiddush before the mezainis, but you're not shaming it because you couldn't really do it on the mezainis, as opposed to the hamaitzi. You could have, in theory, even though the mitzvah is to make it on wine, but in theory, if you don't have wine, the halach is that you make it on challah, and therefore you would be another reason why you would be embarrassing it. In other words, there's room for both opinions. So if you see one person doing it one way, don't get agitated. Let them do it how they're doing it. You do it how you're doing it, and it should be Shalom al Yisrael. Again, if there's any questions, please free to text, email, or if you're in the Google Live, you could ask through there. But since most, I think, are on the YouTube channel, they can. Have a good night.